My grandmother with dementia kept asking for the baby in the basement. We laughed it off until renovations began. Then the contractor found something behind the wall. I'm so glad you're here, guys. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments whether you're watching from Earth. Nadine, my grandmother, had been asking about the baby for 3 months straight, and honestly, we thought she'd lost the plot completely. My sister Jasmine and I would exchange those looks across the dinner table, the kind where your eyebrows do all the talking while grandma's spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate like she's building the pyramids. "Where's the baby?" she'd ask, her voice thin and worried, fingers drumming on the worn oak table that had been in our family since before integration was even a fever dream. "The baby in the basement. Where is she?" Jasmine would pat her hand and say something soothing about how there was no baby, how maybe she was thinking of one of us when we were little. But Nadine would shake her head with this stubborn set to her jaw that reminded me exactly where Jasmine got her attitude from. The thing about dementia is that it turns your grandmother into this unreliable narrator of her own life, mixing up Tuesday with 1952, confusing your face with your father's, but swearing up and down about details that never existed. We'd been dealing with it for 2 years now, ever since she'd left a pot on the stove and nearly burned down her kitchen trying to make collard greens at 3 in the morning. That's when we knew she couldn't live alone anymore, and since I was the one without kids and with the bigger house, she moved into my place in Richmond, Virginia, a city that had seen enough secrets buried in its soil to last several lifetimes. Her old house sat empty for months, a narrow 2-story Victorian on a street where every building leaned slightly to the left like they were all sharing the same inside joke. The place was 120 years old if it was a day, with floors that creaked a symphony when you walked, and windows that rattled whenever an 18-wheeler passed by. We'd grown up visiting that house every Sunday after church, the smell of her peach cobbler meeting us at the door before we even knocked, back when Grandpa Maurice was still alive and would sit on the porch solving crossword puzzles with a pencil he'd sharpened down to a nub. After he passed in 2019, Nadine had stayed there alone, insisting she was fine, that she didn't need anybody hovering over her like she was made of glass, until the stove incident proved otherwise. Now we were finally getting around to renovating it, planning to make it accessible so maybe she could move back in on her better days, the ones where she remembered who we were, and could navigate a conversation without veering off into stories about people we'd never heard of. We hired this contractor named Vincent, a 50-something black man built like he'd been constructed from the same brick as the houses he renovated, with hands that looked like they could crush walnuts but handled his tools with the precision of a surgeon. He came recommended by Jasmine's coworker, had been in the business for 30 years, and had this reputation for being thorough to the point of annoying, the kind of guy who'd stop everything to make sure a corner was perfectly square even if it meant the job took an extra week. "Y'all know this basement got some issues," Vincent told us on day 1, standing in Nadine's cramped kitchen with his clipboard and his reading glasses perched on his head like a second set of eyes. "Foundation's solid enough, but whoever finished this basement did it in stages, probably over decades. Got brick walls that don't match, concrete poured in different eras, whole thing's a timeline of amateur construction." Jasmine nodded like she understood anything about construction beyond watching home improvement shows while folding laundry. "Just make it safe and clean, that's all we need." Vincent had been working for 2 weeks when he called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice carrying this weird tension that made my stomach drop before he even said why he was calling. "Kendrick, you need to get over here. Your sister too if she can make it. Found something behind the basement wall, and I ain't touching it till y'all see it first." I was in the middle of a meeting about quarterly projections, the kind of corporate tedium that makes you question your life choices. But something in Vincent's tone made me close my laptop and grab my keys. I called Jasmine from the car, and she met me at the house 20 minutes later, pulling up in her SUV, still wearing her scrubs from the hospital, her nurse's badge swinging from her lanyard. Vincent was waiting in the basement, which had been transformed into a construction zone of exposed brick, plastic sheeting, and that fine layer of dust that gets into everything. He'd been demolishing an interior wall, one of those additions that someone had built decades ago for reasons nobody remembered, and there in the gap where brick used to be was a space about 2 feet deep, like a little alcove that had been deliberately sealed off. Sitting in that space was a wooden box, maybe the size of a toaster, covered in dust so thick it looked like gray fur. The wood was dark with age, and someone had carved these delicate designs into the lid, little images that my eyes struggled to make sense of in the dim basement light. Haven't touched it, Vincent said, standing back with his arms crossed like he was giving the box plenty of personal space. But I could see those carvings. And something about this whole setup feels intentional, you know? Like somebody didn't just lose this thing, they hid it. Jasmine moved closer, her phone flashlight cutting through the basement gloom, and that's when I saw what was carved into the lid. A cradle, rocking on curved runners, with tiny details etched into the wood by someone who'd taken their time, who'd cared enough to make it beautiful. My sister's hand went to her mouth, and we both knew without saying it that this had something to do with the baby Nadine kept asking about, the one we'd been so sure was just her mind playing tricks. I reached for the box, my hands shaking slightly, and lifted it from its hiding place. It was heavier than I expected, and when I turned it over, I found a small brass latch, tarnished green with age but still intact. The three of us moved upstairs to the kitchen where the light was better, and I set the box on the same table where Nadine had served us countless meals, where we'd done homework and played cards and listened to her tell stories about growing up in a Richmond that didn't want her in its restaurants or schools. The latch resisted at first, stuck with decades of neglect, but Vincent produced a screwdriver and worked it gently until something inside gave way with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. I lifted the lid, and the smell hit me first. That particular scent of old fabric and paper and time itself, sweet and musty and impossibly sad. Inside was a christening gown, the kind of delicate white thing that belonged in a museum, with lace so fine it looked like spiderweb and tiny pearl buttons marching down the back. Underneath that was a photograph, the edges brown and curled, showing a young woman in a simple dress standing in front of this very house, her hand resting on the porch railing, her face caught between a smile and something else, something that looked like grief wearing a disguise. "That's Grandma," Jasmine whispered, picking up the photo with careful fingers. "Look at her face. That's definitely her, but she can't be more than 25 here." The woman in the photo had Nadine's eyes, that same shape to her mouth, but her face was unlined, and her hair was dark and styled in those victory rolls that women wore in old movies. Which meant this picture was ancient, probably from the 40s based on the dress and the quality of the photograph itself. Tucked beneath the photo was an envelope, yellowed and fragile, with "Private" written across the front in handwriting I recognized from the birthday cards Nadine used to send us, that distinctive cursive with the elaborate capital letters. My hands felt clumsy as I opened it, terrified I'd tear something that had survived this long, and inside was a letter written on paper so thin I could see my fingers through it. The date at the top read April 14, 1948, and it started with, "To whoever finds this." Like Nadine had known even then that someday someone would. I read it out loud, my voice cracking on certain words, while Jasmine gripped my arm and Vincent stood respectfully silent. I need to write this down, because I can't carry it alone anymore, and I can't tell anyone. Not Maurice, not my mother, not the women at church who would look at me different if they knew. I had a baby girl on February 2nd of this year, and she was born sleeping, that's what the midwife called it, sleeping, like she was just taking a nap and might wake up any minute. But she didn't wake up, and I held her for 3 hours in that upstairs bedroom, while the midwife cleaned up, and my mother sat downstairs crying, because we couldn't tell anyone, couldn't have a funeral, couldn't even register her birth, because then we'd have to register her death, and people would ask questions. Maurice was away working in Norfolk, didn't even know I was pregnant because I'd been so careful to hide it, wearing loose dresses and avoiding people in those last months. We weren't married yet, you see. We were engaged, but the wedding wasn't until June, and having a baby before that would have destroyed both our families in this town, in this time. My mother helped me deliver her in secret, and then she helped me bury the truth. I named her Grace, just in my head, just for those 3 hours, and I made this gown for her even though she never got to wear it properly. The midwife wrapped her in it anyway, for those hours, and then took it off before she took the baby away to be buried somewhere I was never told. Somewhere my mother said it was better I didn't know. This box is all I have left. This gown and this photo taken a week before I knew I was expecting, when I thought Maurice and I would have a simple life, with no secrets between us. I sealed this up in the basement because I couldn't throw it away but couldn't keep it where I might see it every day. Maybe this is cowardice, hiding instead of mourning proper, but in 1948 in Richmond, Virginia, this was all the mourning a girl like me was allowed. If you're reading this, I hope the world is different now. I hope secrets like this don't have to exist anymore. I hope my Grace would have lived in better times. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of Jasmine crying, these quiet tears that ran down her face while she pressed her fingers to her mouth, and I felt my own throat closing up because this explained everything. The baby in the basement wasn't confusion or dementia inventing phantom children. It was Nadine's mind stripping away the years, and the careful silence, and circling back to the one truth she'd never been allowed to speak out loud. "She's been asking about Grace," I said, my voice rough. "All this time she's been asking about her daughter, and we kept telling her she was wrong." Vincent cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable in the way people do when they've witnessed something intensely private. "I'm gonna step outside, let y'all process this. But there's something else you should know, something I noticed when I was taking down that wall." We followed him back to the basement where he pointed to the brickwork around where the box had been hidden. "See how this section here is different? Older brick, different mortar, that's original to the house, probably 1900s. But this section wrapping around it, this is from the 40s, I'd bet money on it. Matches the style and materials from that era. Now look here." He moved his flashlight to another section. "This part's been repaired, probably 70s based on the mortar composition. And here again, this is even more recent, maybe 90s. Jasmine frowned, following his light. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying somebody opened this wall up multiple times over the years and then sealed it back. Your grandmother didn't just hide this box once and forget about it. She came back to it, or somebody else did, checking on it, maybe adding to it, I don't know. But this wasn't a one-time thing. This was maintained." The implication sat heavy in my chest. This image of Nadine coming down to this basement over decades, carefully removing bricks, checking on this last remaining piece of the daughter she'd lost, then sealing it back up and returning to her life upstairs, where she'd eventually marry Maurice, have my father, build a whole existence on top of this buried grief. We brought Nadine to the house 3 days later, on a Saturday morning when her mind seemed clearer than usual, one of those windows of lucidity that showed up randomly, like radio signals coming through static. She sat at the kitchen table while Jasmine and I explained what we'd found, showing her the box, the gown, the letter in her own handwriting from 77 years ago. Her hands shook as she touched the fabric, her fingers remembering the texture even if her mind couldn't quite catch up, and she started crying these silent tears that broke my heart clean in half. "Grace," she whispered, the name emerging like she was testing it out, seeing if it still fit in her mouth after all these years. "My baby Grace. I thought maybe I dreamed her. Thought maybe none of it was real because nobody ever talked about it, not even Mama before she died." Jasmine knelt beside her chair, holding her hand. "She was real, Grandma. And you loved her enough to keep this for her, to remember her even when nobody else could." Nadine's face crumpled, and she pulled the gown to her chest, rocking slightly. "Mama made me promise never to tell Maurice. Said it would ruin everything. Said he'd leave me if he knew I'd been pregnant before the wedding, even if the baby was his. So I married him 2 months later wearing white and pretending nothing had happened. And then I had your grandfather thinking it was our first child. And I loved your daddy with everything I had. But there was always this hole, you understand? Always this empty place where Grace should have been." I glanced at Jasmine, both of us thinking the same thing. How Nadine had carried this for 77 years. How she'd buried it so deep that even dementia couldn't fully erase it. How the baby in the basement had been real all along and we'd dismissed it as confusion. "We want to do something for her," I said carefully. "For Grace, we want to acknowledge her, give you a chance to grieve properly after all this time." Nadine looked up, her eyes wet but sharp, more present than I'd seen her in months. "A grave? I want her to have a grave with a name, even if there's nothing to bury, even if she's been gone for longer than most people live." We held a small ceremony at the cemetery where Maurice was buried, just the 3 of us and Vincent, who'd offered to come in that quiet way of his that suggested he understood something about secrets and grief. We'd ordered a small marker that read, "Grace, February 2nd, 1948, forever loved, forever remembered," and placed it next to Maurice's headstone because Nadine insisted that's where she belonged, next to the father who'd never known she existed but would have loved her anyway. The chaplain from Jasmine's church said a few words about lives remembered and love that transcends death, and Nadine placed the christening gown in a display case we'd commissioned, something that would protect it from further decay while keeping it visible. Afterward, we sat in the car for a while, nobody quite ready to leave, and Nadine spoke into the silence. "I went down to that basement every few years, opened up that wall just enough to check on the box, make sure it was still there, still safe. Maurice never knew why I spent so much time fussing with that basement, said it was my domain and he didn't question it. After he died, I didn't open it as much, got harder to move those bricks with my arthritis, but I always knew it was there. Did Grandpa really never know? Jasmine asked. Nadine smiled, this sad, knowing expression. He knew something, I think, toward the end, when he was dying and I was sitting with him telling him about our life together. He squeezed my hand and said, "Whatever you're carrying, baby, you can put it down now," and I think he meant Grace. I think somehow he'd figured it out, or suspected, or maybe just knew me well enough to sense there was more to the story. The revelation sat with us during the drive back. This idea that Maurice had given Nadine permission to share the secret, even as dementia was beginning to steal her ability to explain it properly, and now here we were, 3 generations later, finally understanding what the baby in the basement had meant. Vincent finished the renovation 2 weeks later, and the basement was clean and bright, the walls smooth and freshly painted, no trace of the hiding place except in our memories. We moved Nadine back into the house, and she seemed different, lighter somehow, like releasing Grace's story had lifted weight she didn't know she was carrying. Her dementia didn't improve, that's not how the disease works, but she stopped asking about the baby, stopped searching for something she could finally acknowledge had been found. One evening I stopped by to check on her, and she was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, watching the street with this peaceful expression. "You know what nobody tells you about secrets?" she said without looking at me, her voice clear and present. "They don't actually protect you from anything, they just make you lonely in a room full of people." I sat down beside her, and we watched the neighborhood settle into darkness, the streetlights flickering on one by one, and I thought about all the ways we inherit our families, silences along with their stories, how sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to what sounds like nonsense and trust that underneath there's truth waiting to be excavated like artifacts behind basement walls, and how Nadine had spent 77 years being the only one who remembered Grace existed until dementia gave her the strange gift of insisting on that truth even when nobody believed her.